The last thing Petra Vasquez heard before the universe cracked open was a sound like a telephone box falling through wet concrete from a very great height. She was standing in the archive basement of the Temporal Continuity Authority, Level 7, which was not supposed to be accessible to field agents, and was definitely not supposed to smell like ozone and burnt toast. She had a broken stylus in one hand, 17 unprocessed anomaly reports in her bag, and absolutely zero context for why the air 6 feet to her left had just folded itself inside out and deposited a human being onto the floor. Not an alien, a human, which, given where she was and what she did for a living, was somehow the strangest part. Right, the person said from the floor. They were sitting up slowly, patting their jacket as though checking all their pockets were still attached to the same dimension. They appeared to be in their early 30s, brown skin, close-cropped hair, wearing a long coat that had seen considerable use. Their eyes, when they finally focused, were the kind of tired that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with having watched too many centuries pass. Okay, that was not ideal. Who are you? Petra asked, which in retrospect was the wrong question. The right question was, how are you still breathing, given that the spatial corridor you just fell through would have turned most matter into a fine red mist? But she was new to this. Called Kael, the person said. They stood, brushing archive dust from their coat. And you are standing in a building that is going to be very important in approximately 47 minutes. Important how? Kael looked at her with those ancient eyes and said, very gently, the way you'd tell someone their house was on fire if the house was also the concept of causality. The Vorith are going to open it. Petra had heard of the Vorith the way most people had heard of bad weather in distant provinces. Abstractly, as something that happened to other people. She knew the official briefings. Hive architecture species, nonlinear temporal cognition. They experienced time the way humans experienced a crowded room. All at once, every moment simultaneously, impossible to move through without bumping into something. They had been pushing against the borders of human-controlled space for 11 years. They had never lost a direct engagement. The TCA's position was that diplomatic channels remained open. The TCA's position was, Petra had always privately suspected, optimistic to the point of delusion. Open it for what? She asked. Kael's jaw tightened. They're going to extract something from this archive. Cartograph. A temporal map. If they get it, they can see every fixed point in human history simultaneously. Every moment that cannot be changed and every moment that can. A pause, every weak point, every wound. Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, how do you know this? Because, Kael said, and something in their voice went briefly, unbearably far away. I've already watched it happen once. And I've been running backward through the wreckage ever since, trying to find the exact moment where it could have gone differently. This was the part, Petra would later reflect, where a sensible person would have called her supervisor. Her supervisor was a man named Director Holst, who had spent 22 years filing reports about the Vorith threat and doing nothing, and somewhere between that thought and the next. She heard the building's proximity alarm go off, and then she stopped thinking about calling anyone at all. The Vorith entry team came through the service corridor. 5 of them. Bilateral symmetry but wrong. Joints that bent in too many places. Sensory clusters instead of faces. Wrapped in a kind of folded light armor that didn't so much deflect damage as convince local space-time that the damage hadn't happened yet. They moved with the horrible fluency of creatures who could see every possible path through a room at once and were simply taking the best one. Petra had a standard issue disruption baton. Kael had a device about the size of a television remote that buzzed faintly blue when pointed at the intruders. That's not going to work, Petra said. Probably not, Kael agreed. It'll annoy them, which buys us 2 minutes. 2 minutes for what? For you to tell me where the cartograph is stored. I don't have clearance for that. Kael looked at her. Unkindly, not impatiently. 8. The way someone looks at you when they've had this exact conversation before, and they already know you're going to change your mind. Petra, I need you to trust me. You just fell out of a spatial rift, and you want me to trust you. I've been at this for. A flicker of something painful crossed their face, a very long time. I have watched a lot of things go wrong. I have watched humans specifically do incredibly stupid, brave, brilliant things in the worst possible moments, and I have never once stopped being astonished by it. Their voice had gone quiet and completely steady. You are the right person. You are the right moment. I need the cartograph, and I need you to show me where it is. Petra thought about Director Holst. She thought about 11 years of nothing. She looked at the 5 Vorath, methodically dismantling the archive's outer door, and thought, well, nobody's getting promoted for following protocol today. Sub-basement 3, she said. Follow me. They ran. The sub-basement of the TCA archive was not a place that appeared on any map. It was the kind of place that existed only in whispered briefings and security memos, written in careful, bloodless bureaucratic language. And it smelled like cold metal and very old time. The walls had a faint iridescence to them, residual temporal energy from the artifacts stored behind them, leaking through the containment like light through old curtains. Kael moved through the corridors with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had studied the blueprints. Petra realized had been here before, multiple times, possibly in multiple directions. Cartograph is behind a Class 4 temporal lock, she said, keeping pace. You need biometric clearance from 2 senior staff and a director-level override. Right. Kael did not slow down. I'll need your hand, my hand, the biometric part. I have the override handled. How? Kael pulled something from their coat pocket, a flat disc, worn smooth from handling, etched with characters Petra didn't recognize. I've been carrying this for a long time. They said. I've never actually used it. I wasn't sure it would work, and I was saving it. A small, private smile. The right moment. What is it? A very old promise. They tucked it away. Come on. The lock room was at the end of a corridor lined with sealed chambers. Each chamber held a different kind of impossible, a moment that had been removed from history for safekeeping, or a future that had been quarantined, or a fold of time that hadn't yet decided what to do with itself. Petra could feel them as she passed. A subtle pressure behind the eyes, like trying to remember something you'd never known. She pressed her palm to the reader. The machine considered. Accepted. Kael pressed the disc to the second reader and spoke 3 words in a language Petra didn't recognize. The language sounded like it had been built to describe things that had no names in any human tongue, things at the edge of what a mind could hold. The lock disengaged. The cartograph was not what Petra had expected. She had imagined something physical, a sphere, perhaps, or a crystal, some artifact of obvious grandeur. She found was a flat disc of dark material, roughly the size of a dinner plate, inert and unadorned. It could have been mistaken for a cutting board by anyone who didn't know what looking at a complete map of human temporal vulnerability felt like. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with the whole history of your species spread out below you, and realizing just how many times something had nearly gone the other way. This is it, she said. This is it. It doesn't look like they never do. Kael picked it up with both hands, careful and deliberate. The Vorath have been hunting this for 3 decades. Believe that, with it, they can find a moment early enough in human history to change the outcome of every contact event. To not just win the war, but to have won every war, always before it started. Their hands tightened slightly. The frustrating thing is they're not wrong. If they got this, they could do exactly that. Then we get it out. Yes, how? There are 5 of them between here and any exit, and the spatial corridor you arrived through is still open, Kael said. Shh, barely. And it's unstable, which means it'll collapse in. A glance at the device on their wrist. 9 minutes. 9 minutes to get past 5 Vorath. 5 Vorath who have superior sensory range, tactical prediction capability, and the ability to briefly experience events before they happen. Kael paused. Which is actually where it gets interesting. Interesting, Petra repeated, in the tone of a person for whom the word had temporarily inverted its meaning. The Vorath experience time non-linearly. That's their great advantage. They see the move before you make it. They see the consequence before you act. They know the outcome of any engagement before it begins. Kael set the cartograph down carefully on the shelf and turned to face her. But they have a weakness. A real one. It's not a tactical weakness, it's an ontological one. It goes all the way down to the root of what they are. Petra waited. They can't understand improvisation, Kael said. Not really. Their cognitions runs on pattern, on the weight of probability, on what has happened before and what will happen next. They see all the likely futures. They navigate between them. But a mind sees all futures simultaneously, also sees the weight of each one. They navigate by probability mass. They move toward the dense futures and away from the thin ones. So if you do something that has no probable future, they can't track it. Something flickered in Kael's face. Something that had been buried for a long time, under all that weariness, and was pushing toward the surface. They encounter it and their system seize up for just a moment, trying to assign a likelihood to an action that has no precedent. An action so specifically, stubbornly human, that it doesn't appear anywhere in their probability architecture because no reasonable organism would ever choose to do it. Petra thought about this. So we need to do something stupid, profoundly stupid, beautifully, specifically, only a human being would think of this stupid. Kael picked the cartograph back up. Do you trust me? You keep asking me that. I keep meaning it. She looked at them, the worn coat, the old eyes, the disc in their pocket, carried for years, as a promise waiting to be kept. Something in the back of her mind wondered about the long shape of this person's life. All the impossible things they had seen, all the times they had stood in a room, exactly like this one, with the clock running down and chosen to run toward the problem instead of away from it. Yes, she said. I trust you. The smile was brief and genuine and lit something up behind those tired eyes. Good. Then I need you to listen very carefully, because I'm only going to explain this once. What Kael explained was, objectively, the worst plan Petra had ever heard. It was the kind of plan that would have gotten laughed and out of any serious tactical briefing. It involved timing, a fire suppression system, the specific acoustic properties of the sub-basement's containment corridor, and one other element that she was going to need to supply herself. Can't sing, she said. You don't need to sing well. Why does there need to be singing at all? Because the Vorith have never in their 3,000 years of recorded history encountered a species that sings while under mortal threat, Kael said. It doesn't appear in their probability architecture because it is, from any rational standpoint, insane. And humans do it constantly. They sang on ships crossing oceans they couldn't see the other side of. They sang in siege lines and hospital wards, and tiny dark places with the roof coming down. They sing because the act of making music is an act of insisting that you are still here and still yourself, and it terrifies anything that has never understood why you would bother. A beat. Also, the resonant frequency of your voice at that pitch will vibrate the containment panels and trigger the fire suppression system, which we need for the second phase. Petra stared at him. You said you trusted me, Kael said. I did not anticipate the singing. Nobody ever does. That's rather the point. The plan required 7 minutes of precise execution and relied on approximately 4 things that had to work in sequence, and one thing that Kael simply described as a calculated gamble on the human tendency to be annoyingly effective at the worst possible moment. Which Petra gathered was her. They moved to the threshold of the corridor. The 5 Vorith were 20 meters away. At the far end, their sensory clusters turning slowly as they processed the temporal geometry of the space. Proved they knew someone was here. They were following the probability currents through the building, narrowing down position, narrowing down trajectory. Kael looked at Petra, just for a second. Kind of look that passed between 2 people who were about to do something very dumb together and had made peace with it. She started singing. It wasn't a good song. It was a children's song her mother had sung to her. Something about the stars being each one a door, and every door opening onto a road, and every road leading somewhere worth going. She had not sung it since she was 6 years old. She sang it off-key, at the top of her lungs, and she stepped out into the corridor at the same time. The effect on the Vorith was immediate and extraordinary. They stopped. Not tactically. They didn't take cover or adopt defensive posture. Challenge. They stopped the way a machine stops when you plug an incompatible input into it, the way a calculation stops when the variable you've just introduced doesn't resolve. Sensory clusters flared, and then oriented toward her, with the singular focused attention of 5 intelligences that had just encountered something that their entire probability architecture had no category for. A human being, under immediate mortal threat, singing a lullaby about doors and roads. It lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds of complete Vorith cognitive arrest, their bodies motionless, their probability processing overwhelmed by the sheer irrational human wrongness of the act. Kael was already moving. Through the fire suppression panel on the left wall, which the vibration had unlocked. Foam that poured from the suppression system was not standard issue. The sub-basement stored temporal artifacts, and its fire suppression was specifically designed to disrupt the spatial coherence of anything caught in the cascade. It hit 3 of the Vorith, and they blurred, their armor's local spacetime convincing properties suddenly arguing with the foam's spatial disruption. And for about 6 seconds they were in several slightly different positions simultaneously, unable to commit to any of them. The other 2 broke from their cognitive arrest and turned toward Kael. Petra hit the nearest one with her disruption baton. The baton was not going to do much against Vorith armor, which was true, but what it did do was make a very loud and specific kind of noise that resonated in the corridor and triggered a second cycle of the suppression system, which Kael had predicted, and she had not entirely believed. The foam took the second Vorith team, all 5 of them, scattered, displaced, shunted into temporary non-coherence. They had 45 seconds before the Vorith reoriented. They ran for the corridor. The spatial rift was still open, just barely. It was narrower than it had been, the edges flickering, the space inside it the color of a television tuned to a channel that didn't exist. Kael went through first, then turned back and reached out a hand. Petra. She looked back at the archive. 11 years of nothing. The Vorith behind her, recovering. The cartograph under Kael's arm, small and dark, and carrying the weight of every brittle human moment there had ever been. She took the hand. The rift took them. What came next was not a comfortable experience. Transit through an unstable spatial corridor felt, Petra, like being remembered by a place you'd never been. A sudden rush of somewhere else, of context without content, and then the floor. She was in a room she didn't recognize. Clean lines, white surfaces, the faint background hum of very serious technology. The rift behind her flickered and closed. "Where are we?" she asked. "My ship," Kael said. She looked around. There was no obvious control room, no visible navigation. Just the room and a large central table covered in maps, and one other person standing by the table with their arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone who had been waiting a very long time. Person was older, same coat, different eyes, or maybe the same eyes with more in them, more distance, more landscape. "You made it," the older version said. And the voice was the same, but the weight in it was different. The way a song sounds different in a different key. "We made it," Kael said. "Does she know?" "Not yet." Petra looked between them. "Know what?" Kael set the cartograph on the table, very carefully, with the reverence of someone setting down something they'd been carrying for a very long time. "The Vorith aren't just trying to access human history," they said. "They're trying to access the point where humans first made contact with non-human intelligence. The first reach, 11,000 years ago. Before language, before civilization, before any of what came after." A pause. "There's a version of that meeting that goes differently, where the encounter ends badly, and something fundamental about the way humans develop changes. The Vorith believe that if they can push events toward that version, everything downstream changes too. Not a war, an erasure. But the cartograph shows them how to find that pressure point, yes." Kael touched the edge of it. It also shows us. And we've had 11 years of absolutely nothing, which I appreciate is frustrating, but was actually necessary. We needed them to come for the cartograph. We needed them to try. because the moment they tried was the moment we could identify which approach vector they intended to use, and which pressure point in the first reach event they believed was accessible. The older Kael moved to the other side of the table, and now we know. Petra looked at the cartograph, at the two of them, at the way they stood on opposite sides of the same event, connected by the long thread of whatever Kael's life looked like when you laid it end to end. "You've been planning this," she said. "Running it," Kael said. "There's a difference. Planning implies you knew how it was going to go. It means you were very strongly hoping. And now?" "Now," the older Kael said, "we go to the first reach. And we're going to need someone from the TCA who knows the archive protocols, because the access point we need to use is behind the same kind of lock you just opened." A look at Petra. Calm, certain. "I told you, right person, right moment." Petra thought about Director Holst. She thought about 11 years of unprocessed anomaly reports. Thought about the sound of her own voice, echoing off the containment corridor walls. A children's song about doors and roads. And 5 Vorath minds halted in their tracks by the one thing they'd never learned to predict. She thought, "The universe is very large and very old, and I have been standing in a basement for 3 years. And that seems, in retrospect, like a considerable waste." "All right," she said. "Tell me about the first reach." The first reach was not a name for a place. It was a name for an event, a 6-hour window in the late Paleolithic, where a small group of anatomically modern humans on the eastern shore of what would eventually be the Caspian Sea had an encounter with an intelligence that had crossed 30 light years to observe them. The intelligence, the records Kael showed her, were fragmentary, reconstructed from physical evidence and temporal imaging, had not intended contact. It had been an accident of proximity, a scout mission running too close to a populated zone. The humans had been a family group, 8 adults, 4 children, by any measure, entirely outmatched. They had no technology beyond stone and fire. And the complicated social architecture that 400,000 years of being prey had hammered into the human genome like a survival theorem. What they had was fire. What they had was each other. What they had, apparently, was the deeply human compulsion to, when confronted with the genuinely unknown, sit down and try to figure it out rather than run. The alien intelligence. The record called them the Urketh, though the name was a later reconstruction, had spent 6 hours watching them, and somewhere in those 6 hours, something had shifted in the Urketh's assessment of the small warm creatures who were watching them back with bright and fearless eyes. The Vorith believed there was a moment in that 6-hour window where the Urketh's assessment could have gone the other way. A moment of maximum uncertainty, where the weight of probability between continued observation and termination had been nearly balanced. A small nudge in the direction would have ended the encounter and everything that came and everything that after it, before it started. "The Vorith want to push that moment," Kael said, as they stood at the threshold of the first reach temporal corridor. "They want to push the Urketh's assessment toward termination, and we're here to stop them. We're here to make sure it doesn't happen. A beat. By being there." Petra thought about that. "Won't our presence create a paradox?" "It would," Kael said, "if we interact with the event. Not going to interact. We're going to be a background presence. A slight weight on the probability scales. We're going to be enough to shift the Urketh's assessment back toward continued observation, if the Vorith manage to nudge it." A small, strange smile. "We are, essentially, going to haunt 11,000 years of human history for about 6 hours without touching anything. And if the Vorith show up in force, then we deal with them." The older Kael, who had been silent for most of the briefing, spoke from the back of the room, "With the one advantage we have, which is..." Kael, younger Kael, looked at her, the old eyes. The long-coded certainty of someone who had been running this race for years and had never quite stopped believing they were going to finish it. "We are humans," they said, "which means we have already survived, at this moment, in our history, 47 contact events that went badly, 8 extinction-level environmental shifts, 4 near collapses of the social structures that made civilization possible, and one period of several thousand years, where we were not the most successful hominid on the continent, and we outlasted the others anyway. We are here, at this moment, talking about an event 11,000 years ago, because we are extraordinarily, unreasonably, stubbornly hard to kill. A pause. The Vorath, think of that as a puzzle. I think of it as a strategy. The Caspian shore at the end of the Paleolithic was cold, and smelled like river silt and pine resin, and the particular quality of wood smoke that belonged to a time before processed fuel. The sky was vast and unpolluted and full of stars. The Urketh vessel was not visible. It was in low orbit, small and dark, but its presence registered as a slight distortion in the upper atmosphere, a shimmer at the edge of perception. The family group was 200 meters away, afire. Voices that were not quite language yet, but were reaching toward it. Sounds that carried the complexity of something trying to become meaning. Petra stood very still and watched them, and felt something happen behind her sternum that she didn't have a word for. The Vorath came through 20 minutes in. Not a full team, 3 of them, dropped from a transit point 500 meters north, moving with their characteristic fluid precision through the undergrowth. We're heading for the Urketh's orbital position, not for the humans. They were going to push signal, a manufactured threat stimulus in the electromagnetic signature of the humans, calibrated to register to the Urketh's threat assessment architecture as a hostile action. Not even changing what happened, just changing what the Urketh saw, adding one extra weight to the dangerous side of the scale. Kael was already moving. What happened next was not elegant. It was not the kind of thing that got written up in tactical briefings. It was 3 people, one of them temporally displaced, one of them a junior archivist from a mid-level TCA office who had been in the sub-basement on a routine filing assignment this morning, and a technology they'd borrowed from the TCA archive, adapted by Kael over years of running and learning, and being repeatedly wrong about what would work. The technology was, in essence, a very precise application of the same principle the Vorath were attempting to use. A signal calibrated to the Urketh's threat assessment architecture, running in the opposite direction. Not a threat, something else, something that would register to 30 light-year traveled alien cognition as the signal profile of a species that had spent hundreds of thousands of years learning how to not die, and was, on balance, interesting enough to continue watching. Took Petra to deploy it. Because the signal profile had to be human, actually human, generated by a living human nervous system under real conditions, not synthesized. Biometric signature on the cartograph reader had been the key. The lock had read her, and what it had read, what Kael had been waiting 11 years for the right human to provide, was the specific neural pattern of someone who had, in the last 2 hours, done something improbably brave, sung a children's song at alien soldiers, and chosen to run toward the unknown instead of away from it. The signal went up. The Vorath saw it coming and changed course. 2 of them broke toward her. The third reached the Urketh's transmission band. Kael took the third. Petra took the 2, or rather, they came at her, and she did not run, which was the one thing she had left to contribute. She stood her ground, and they stopped, just for a moment, that same cognitive arrest. Not a lullaby this time, nothing so theatrical, just the plain and baffling fact of a human being who was not afraid enough. A human being, looking at overwhelming odds, and staying anyway, which was something the Vorath probability architecture had filed under improbable, and kept revisiting with growing uncertainty about that classification. 4 seconds. The signal completed its transmission. Above them, invisible in low orbit, the Urketh sat with the data and considered the creatures below. The manufactured threat signature from the Vorath attempted to override the assessment. The countersignal said, "Look closer. Look at what they actually are." The Urketh looked closer. They watched for 3 more hours. Then they left. They left, and they filed a report that would eventually be accessed 11,000 years later by a student researcher studying early contact events, who would describe the encounter as, and the translation was imprecise, but the gist was clear, the first time we understood that something small could also be inexhaustible. The Vorith fell back. Not defeated, they wouldn't stop. Kael said flatly. They never stopped. This was one round, not the whole match. But the pressure point was closed. The moment had settled. The weight on the scale was back where it belonged. They stood on the shore as the fire of the family group burned down to coals. Stars everywhere. A sky that humans would spend the next 11,000 years building languages and sciences and myths to describe. The oldest story. Small creatures looking up at the vast dark and deciding, against all reasonable expectation, to find it interesting rather than terrifying. This is what you've been protecting, Petra said. Always, Kael said. She looked at them. At the coat, at the device on their wrist, at the disc in their pocket that had finally been used. The old promise finally kept. She thought about what it cost to carry something for that long. To run toward the same problem over and over across the decades. Getting a little closer each time. Being wrong and adjusting and trying again. To believe in the species at the end of the long chain of improbable survivals. All the way back to a fire on a cold shore. Have you been at this alone? She's asked. Kael was quiet for a moment. Mostly. There were others at different points. People I found in the right moment. A pause. That's the thing about humans. You keep showing up. In the worst places. At the worst times. Doing the last thing any rational observer would predict. And somehow, their voice caught briefly on something. Somehow it works. Enough times that I stopped being surprised by it and started being grateful. The older Kael had gone ahead through the corridor. Just the two of them. On the shore with the long bridge of human history stretching away in all directions. Impossible and intact. What happens now? Petra asked. The TCA needs to know what the Vorith were really after. They need to reclassify the threat. 11 years of nothing is over. Kael pulled the disc from their pocket and turned it over in their fingers once, twice, then tucked it away again. Habit or farewell. And I need to get back to the other 17 pressure points I've identified in the last 3 years before the Vorith decide to try a different approach. Alone. A long pause. The stars overhead. The smell of pine resin and cold water and the edge of history. I've been alone long enough, Kael said, and looked at her with those impossible old eyes, and said nothing else. Petra thought about the sub-basement, about the stylus in her hand, and the 17 unprocessed anomaly reports, about Director Holst, and the comfortable paralysis of doing the sensible thing for so many years that you stopped noticing there were other options. She thought about singing in a corridor with the ceiling metaphorically coming down and the strange, unlooked-for joy of discovering that the improbable thing had worked. I want a proper briefing, she said. Not the version where you explain things in motion while running. An actual briefing, maps timeline. All 17 pressure points. That will take a while. I have time. Something shifted in Kael's face. Not quite the smile. Something older than a smile, and quieter, and more specific. The expression of someone who had been running for a long time and had just, for the first time in a very long time, stopped to look at what they were running toward. All right, they said. Come on then. They walked back through the corridor together. Behind them, on the cold Paleolithic shore, the fire burned down to ash and the stars wheeled overhead, and the small family group slept their deep ancient sleep, unaware of how many futures had just been decided on their behalf, and continued, as they always had, to exist. Which was given everything, not nothing. Which was given everything, the entire point.